Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Quitcast. My name is Becca. Today, we're going to talk about the beginning of the author archetypes discussion. And I have to lay some groundwork in order for us to get into the bulk of the meat of the process of utilizing author archetypes, because there are some terms that I want us to know and think about. And so I'm going to dive deep into the terms today, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the other parts of the process in later videos. The whole reason that I developed this particular tool in the author archetypes, that's the tool that we're talking about. The whole reason I developed it is because I would be sitting in coaching calls. And again, at this point in my career, I'm approaching 6,000 individual different people, authors, coached. And I would sit in coaching calls with authors and I would say, this is normal for people who are wired like you, right? Like I would often say, they would say, but I'm only producing one book a year. Right, but that's normal. And they would say, well, how is that normal? Show me how that's normal. And it was hard for me because I can't just say things that have been revealed to me in confidence and attribute them to individual authors. Unless I know an individual author has said it in public on a stage that was, again, that was public, or on a YouTube video or a podcast, I can't just go divulging information that I know from coaching with names attributed. So I couldn't say, I've never coached Stephen King, for instance, but I couldn't say Stephen King told me X, Y, and Z about his process. I can't divulge that out of a coaching call. What I can do is to say, I've coached 45 achiever authors number one achiever authors who all say the exact same thing, and they all talk about the same way. And when we're talking in strengths language, it's easier for me to do that because I can attribute the behavior to a particular place, right? I can say, well, most number one achievers sound like this. How does that sound to you? And that's how we align people in their different strength behaviors. When it falls outside of a particular strength behavior, or for instance, there are a couple of strengths combos that we talk about, power pairs or power trios, that produce a particular type of behavior. And we'll say, oh, that is common for, let's say, input learner intellection as a combo, or input learner strategic, to think in this way. And then I can say, well, that's normal for people who are wired in this way. But what I found myself doing was trying to normalize behaviors and try to get authors to stop trying to change everything every time they go to a conference or read a book or listen to a podcast, because they've heard that this is the way we're supposed to be doing it, though. Like, this is the normal, or this is the rule now. And there are so many of us who have a hard time reading the rules of our own brain types, and then assimilating to those rules because we know that it's okay and normal to be that way. So a huge part of why the author success archetypes are necessary, author archetypes are necessary, a huge part of that is because I know from having coached, again, a statistically relevant number of people, that you can have success by being any one of these 4, 5, 6, 7 ways, depending on what behavior we're talking about. So I needed to come up with a way to communicate that to people and say, here's what I see in the larger pantheon of authors. Again, not what I've noticed on Facebook groups, because that is different. Not what I've noticed from stages, because that is different. In fact, when we get into some of the archetype discussions where we're talking about a particular behavior that authors do, and where authors in general can fall on a continuum of behavior, you'll hear me say things like, almost everyone who talks about this from stage is a blank, 1 out of 4. And then everybody's minds blow for a second, because it's like, wait, I thought all those people were so different because they all have maybe different strengths, or they all have different genres, or they're different ages, or different numbers of books, whatever. And it's like, no, you're hearing primarily from one type of author when you hear this advice. And so that's why we have to represent other types of advice, because the way that type is able to assimilate that advice is different from how other people would, but no one is talking about it from stage, because generally the people who are different from stage type think there's something wrong with them, instead of, no, there's something very right with you. We just need to quantify how that rightness is. That's why author success archetypes have come about for me, is that I feel like there's a need to be able to quantify some of this with people and say, no, 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 there are different patterns of behavior that exist on a continuum in question. Like, let's say one of the first ones that we talk about is the right to market continuum or the product creation continuum. Do all authors write to market or create products for the market in the same way? No, they do not. And it is not that you have success in only one way and everyone has to assimilate to that way, but that's what we hear from stage a lot. And so it's important to know that there are other ways of having success as a product creator or in writing books for a particular market, because that success already exists out there. And if you try to change yourself to behaving in a way that you're not best wired to behave, then you're going to end up kneecapping your success. And so my goal in creating this is to normalize the ways that we're different from each other, specifically as authors. What I wish was true. I just wish that it was so strengths relevant that all I would have to do is say, well, all achiever authors do this, or all competition authors or all intellection authors do this, and then that would be the end of it, right? But the problem is that tactics and outcomes are not always relevant based only on strengths alone. It's part of the reason why it is very hard to create content that is predictive for one individual strength, because what an intellection achiever looks like is different from what an intellection input or intellection strategic looks like. And then if you have all four of those together, you look even different in a third weird way. Not weird, but you know what I mean. A third way that we haven't even talked about yet. And that exists for every combination you could think of, which is why, again, coaching is so necessary for strengths, is because they're very, very nuanced. But is everything about our writing life as nuanced as the individual problems that I have with my individual strengths? No, there are a lot of things that are more general, where there are very clear outlined designations of most authors who act like this will act in this particular way. They'll execute in this particular way. And most authors who are aligned like this will execute in this particular way. There is no relevancy of personality to this in terms of no predictability. There's not a causal personality that creates these archetypes. In fact, when you see me talk about the archetypes, we'll often have some pretty broad generalizations that then we have to nuance in person, because we don't have a test for this yet, right? And that's also the first thing I need to acknowledge. November 2022, we don't have a test for this yet, because we're still making sure that all the language is clear. We're still making sure that all the yes/no decision trees are clear. And that is going to take us some time. But I can't not talk about these anymore, because the way that the rules are changing in publishing, in terms of like when the saturation point in the market hits, and I mean the broad market, not just the niche markets, but when the saturation point in the broad market exists and the gold rush is no longer happening, then we have to learn how to exist outside of the gold rush rules. And we need to learn how to follow the rules of the long-term, more established industry that is being created in the transition time between when the gold rush is over and when the absolute new market exists. And of course, markets always transition and blah, blah, blah. But I'm saying we've been operating with some assumptions that we need to question, which question the premise is not new for us. We understand how that works. But we need to talk about this in terms of, how do I be a better decision maker now that I know that there is no mad rush to make money, because the source of the income is not going to go away just because the market is saturated. It just means the competition is higher. And now we have to change how we think about how to sustain a long-term career instead of how to jump in and make as much money as we can as fast as we can and then hope that it lasts. And so the rules are different, and therefore we need a different metric for how to understand this. So I need to start getting this information out specifically for us to talk about in this community, in the Quitcast community. But also, I need to be able to start presenting the information so that our coaches at the BFA are having these discussions, so that when we sit down with someone who is falling into an archetype on a particular continuum that is not the norm that we always talk about, then we need to know how to guide that person in the right direction and how to help reflect the right questions and things like that. So I need to start talking about these things. You also will have seen me on TikTok doing some individual videos of individual archetypes. We're going to collect all of those together. Those are not in any continuum form the way that they will be on this channel, on the Quitcast channel. I was just doing one-off discussions because we would have someone say like, oh, I do this behavior. And I'd be like, nope, that's normal. You're just a trailblazer. Don't worry about it. Just keep doing the trailblazer thing. And here's how to change your expectations a little bit away from the other archetypes on that continuum, because you're not in those. This is the rules for you. And so when I would do a trailblazer or a phoenix or a bread machine, those are all on different continuums of behavior. So the videos themselves don't have a coherent message. And so I'm hesitant to just put them out. But we're going to put them out on the YouTube channel anyway, just because people have been asking for them. And I don't want to send everybody to TikTok because sometimes, that sucks you in too quickly. And we also want to be as productive as possible. So anyway, here is what is going to happen today. I want to talk about how to read these continuums and why they exist. And then I want to give you an introduction to the first of the continuums that we're going to talk about today in the next video. In the archetypes series, we are going to talk through continuums. So if you know what an archetype is, where there is a base or core set of behaviors that exist that all revolve around a common center. And it's a little bit like having gravity and having planets rotate around the center, right? Like there's some gravity that's holding these behaviors together. And I'm going to do my best whenever I can to talk about both the behaviors themselves that are organized in this way, and also what they have in common, just because I think it's important to be as specific as possible until we have the test finished that people can take the test. And I understand if you would rather wait until the test is done, before you listen to any of this, totally fine with me. But I need to get the information out so we can talk about them. Okay, so continuums and archetypes. The archetypes themselves, collections of behavior that revolve around a central theme. And that archetype is a very big picture, very broad swath of behavior, because the behaviors themselves in the industry, according to any relevant topic, exist on a continuum. The one that I like to start with is plotters and pantsers, because I think a lot of us have already internalized that archetype for ourselves, those archetypes, into that there is a continuum of behavior between those two extremes. So people who outline and people who discovery draft, or plotters and pantsers, however you want to talk about it, whatever language you use. But we instinctively know there's a continuum between those two extremes, and a lot of us fall into the middle. But there are also designations in the middle that have things in common, where it isn't just I'm either a plotter or a pantser or a plantser, because I think that's become the part plotter, part pantser. But how in particularly do I use outlining to get through my manuscript, and how do I not? How do I discover? How do I outline? How do I discover? But there are these two very clear, in the history of writing, teaching, very clear designations of archetypes on one side or the other of a continuum. And all I'm saying when I talk about author archetypes is that all successful author behavior, when it comes to a particular topic, falls on a continuum. All of it does. Every author behavior is somehow related when it's successful to every other behavior, and they are on a continuum somehow. And there almost always are two extremes on either side. And then there are other related behaviors in the middle, and we want to try to categorize those. What I am not doing, and this is important, what I'm not doing is making up 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 designations and just randomly assigning things to them. Because I think there are a lot of people who like the whole, let's create a quiz for this. And then like, hey, I think there might be 4 types of authors, and I don't have any data to back that up. I just have my assumption about how author behavior works. What's important about the work that I'm doing here and the reason it's taking us so long and how I want to validate this is my goal is to create a tool that speaks to all author behavior on some level, all successful author behavior, and to put them in a continuum and to give you a sense for what the broad archetypes are and where you fall into that and why it matters. What these are not is they are not metaphors. So I do not make one of the most common ones we talk about is the trailblazer. I do not make the trailblazer into like I actually want to go out onto the frontier and blaze a real trail through something that's never been done before. So this isn't, for instance, something like the way that we talk about metaphorical things. Like I have story cooking in my head, and therefore I'm a stove. Nope, that is not the same as when we do the story creation continuum, because the reason I organize them into contiguous sets, right, where they actually have a continuum underneath them, is because they usually progress in some trait or another, and that trait is the core organizational term of the continuum. But the archetypes themselves aren't necessarily metaphors, so you won't be usually, there's one that I broke the rule for this on, but I'll explain why when I do it. But they won't be usually like all vehicles or all people or all animals, because that's not the organizing principle. The organizing principle is not that this is a metaphor for something. The organizing principle is, here's all the related behaviors. I broke them up into what feels like an organizing concept that centrally locates all this behavior where it feels like there's gravity there. And then understanding that the relevant part is the core behavior and the core gravity that's creating this organizational principle. And I say that ahead of time because we've had a lot of discussion in our community about how, well, they should all be vehicles, or they should, if one thing uses gas, then they should all use gas, or, if there's a book, then they should all be objects. Nope. I recognize how much we want them to be metaphorical or allegorical, but the point of archetypes is not for them to make sense in relationship to each other. The point of an archetype is for all of the behaviors and that gravitational center to all make sense within itself. And so I'll explain more as we get to the continuums, but I wanted to say that up front because I do think it's really important to differentiate between this is just a metaphor and I'm going to use whatever metaphor I want. You can use whatever metaphors you want to talk about your experience as an author, and they are all valid because they're all your personal experience. What's different is I'm not trying to speak for you as an individual alone. I'm trying to speak for the broader pattern that I see. And so my having coached a lot of individual authors, and specifically a lot of successful individual authors, not just, I didn't just run out into a mall and grab 6,000 people and be like, hey, have you ever thought about writing a book? No, the success patterns that I'm specifically looking at are, this is how successful authors have worked. And so that is also an important piece. The continuums themselves are divided up into some kind of an organizing, like I said, contiguous principle of some kind. I want them all to be related to each other. So for instance, we have an archetype continuum for the right to market or product creation, because there are different ways that product creation or writing to market can happen. And we tend to see them happen in these very specific patterns, again, along a continuum. And then we have one for pace of project, like production, the actual production. We have one for the way that you come up with ideas for marketing. There are all kinds of different continuums, and the archetype part it's a central core organizing principle of the archetype. All of the behaviors have something in common, and then they are on this continuum. So anyway, I had to explain that at the beginning, just because I feel like there is an importance to the way that the program itself is structured, like the way that the tool is going to be structured. When we have more information about that, we'll release it, but hopefully you've made it as far as we've gotten so far, because I want to give you an example of how we're going to talk about these archetypes on the continuums. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly here in a presentation that I have done for a conference, and I'm going to do this presentation in multiple different places on some level. All of my presentations are a little bit different when I do them, but this one in particular was the most recent. And so I just want to show you the way that I think about this when I personally think about how to explain what an archetype is. What I'm looking at is there are the bigger designations, right? Like we have plotters and pantsers as the two main extremes on this particular continuum. And the organizing principle of a plotter or a pantser is how all of these behaviors relate to each other. So there's a combination of personality switches and environmental switches and sliders, things that you can have if you're familiar with min-maxing from character creation in like video games, where you try to minimize some behaviors and maximize others. This is very similar, this concept, except what I'm saying is that some behaviors cannot be changed. Like some of them just exist in us already and they're wired into us and they can't be changed. Or if they can be changed, it's not worth the work of trying to change them, because the work itself would be so much work that it's better to just organize yourself around this core principle. But if you look at this particular combination of switches and sliders in terms of the behavior that you could have stronger or less, and then the on-off switches of do I do this or do I not do this? So the comfort with unpredictability is one of the sliders in the plotters versus pantsers continuum. How comfortable am I with not knowing what's coming, with not knowing? Some people are so high in this, they love the unpredictability of not knowing what's coming. And then they're less likely to be on one extreme of this, right? And I mean in the story, this is specifically in the story. Thinking ahead is on or off. Am I a person who likes to think ahead in the story? Am I a person who needs to think ahead in the story? That's an on-off switch. I either do it or don't. Automatically know what's going to happen in the story. So just by having written what's behind me, do I know automatically what's coming ahead? Yes or no? That's usually a yes or no switch. And do I do it automatically or not? And then my will to keep writing can go up or down, right? And that is not a hardwired thing, as you'll see here in a second. Some of the switches and some of the sliders cannot be changed, and some of them absolutely can be changed. And then the knowing how to outline, that's a skill that I can have or not have. So I can change that skill, but even if I'm at a 10 out of 10 in knowing how to outline, if I am still a no in a lot of these other areas, I'm not going to be able to execute on the outline anyway, because one of the most important behavior questions in this plotter versus pantser is, will I write what I plan to write? Or am I capable of writing what I plan to write? How much relevancy do those two behaviors have to each other? For some of us, we cannot write what we plan, no matter how hard we try. The story itself takes over. There are personality reasons for this. Is it changeable? I don't believe that it is, but I know some people do think that it's changeable. If it is changeable, what I have seen in the past is that it is apparently so difficult to isolate that part of ourselves that we can't max it easily or well. And then the question is, if I could just do it the way that I'm aligned to do it, why would I ever want to waste time changing how I am? Just do it the way you're wired to. It's fine. There are plenty of people having success pantsing. plenty of 7 and 8 figure authors who do not outline. It's fine. But if I am a person who likes to outline and is comfortable with it and good at it, then I should be doing that. That's my best work. So plotting, outlining, and pantsing, neither one of them is righteous to be. They're both good to be, but you'll be a very different person who will do one or the other. Or you will, again, adapt into that core skill that will take advantage of wiring that you already have, basically. And then the last switch is, am I bored with plans? If I plan it, does it make me not want to write it, specifically because I'm so bored with it that now I feel like there's no spark left? Where if I just let myself discovery draft, then I would have the spark to get through the manuscript, and then I would be able to do something else with the manuscript when I'm done. So the reason this is important is that there are some things that are changeable and some that are, the stuff that's in red is more changeable, like more easily changed, because I can increase my motivation easily, will to keep writing, and I could increase my skill more easily because I can take classes on how to outline well. And given the plethora of people talking about outlining, it's also likely that I'll be able to find someone who can teach outlining in a way that makes sense to me if I am going to be able to utilize it. But again, not everyone does it. So when I am one versus the other, like when I am on the extremes of these two, then the min and the max of what I have available to me to utilize is going to be more clear when I'm on the extremes. And most people who are extreme pantsers or extreme plotters have a really clear sense for which one they are. And they often will be the people who, when we're all talking about outlining, the pantsers will be like, not for me, not at all. But then there's all these people in the middle. So one of the things that has been a challenge as a coach is to find accurate representations of the stuff that's going on in the middle, which if plotting and pantsing continuum follows the standard deviation, those extremes are a smaller number of people who are absolutely one or absolutely the other. And then the majority of us, 68+% of us, are falling into one of those categories in the middle. And with this continuum in particular, we're not going to call them plotters and pantsers because that is too, it has too much weight, right? I want to disconnect that. So when we do this particular continuum, there's going to be different names to this, and then the middle is going to look slightly different as well. But the goal in looking at this behavior was to look at those switches and knobs, like the levers, the buttons, the ones that turn up and turn down and are either on or off, and to look at how much of this quality do these people have and how much of this do they not have when they're on one side or the other. And then which of the skills that they have can be turned up or down, depending on, whether they have the capacity to act on those skills or the motivation or not. And is it necessary to be wired in this one way in order to have success? Which, spoiler alert, the answer is always no. But again, I needed to make this into a visual tool and a visceral tool that we could utilize together as a community of writers to try and figure out how to be better decision makers and to decide for ourselves, is this the way that I want to be, or do I want to change myself? I've seen people, probably not on the super extremes, I have to think about that. But I've seen people move away from being outliners into being more organic in their story discovery, and vice versa. I've seen people move from being more pantser style, especially when they're in the middle, to one side or the other. And that's where some of those middle archetypes come from, is that they share some of the qualities of the extremes. And again, all the continuums are going to be slightly different, but this one in particular, they share some of the behaviors of one side or the other, and then we want to quantify how they share those. So as we do presentations on this on the Quitcast in the future, it's going to be my goal to try to talk as specifically as I can about the skills that are relevant to each individual trait. We're going to start off with that particular picture as a way to kind of explain what I'm doing when I'm doing the analytical work in the interviews to try and figure out how people are utilizing these talents. I'm going to try to explain them and quantify them. But also, I think it's important to be able to assess ourselves. I still think that using a plethora of personality tests is the easiest way to start off with assessing some of these traits. And we in particular are fans of the Strengths Finder, obviously, because we all coach the Strengths Finder. We also really like the Enneagram. I think that's really helpful. And we're going to hear from Claire as well. Claire Taylor does Enneagram work for authors, and it's specifically about core fears and core desires of different Enneagram numbers. And I think that's really helpful. We also use other personality metrics that are not necessarily as predictive, but they are helpful for certain characteristics. And I always think that the self-awareness that those tests provide is limited. Like most tests are created, well, all tests are created with a very specific outcome in mind. And then the outcome is helpful in its limited capacity. And then there are some tests that, like, I think the Strengths and Enneagram are significantly more applicable to a wider variety of questions than almost any other test that we've seen. But we utilize a lot of them to try to help place ourselves on some of these continuums and then figure out what's the best way to act for ourselves, right? Like, how do we make good choices about what we should and shouldn't be doing? Some of you who are watching this are already really excellent at self-selecting in and out of stuff in the author community. This is great. We love that you exist. You're a very small portion of people in the community, but we still love that you exist. If you're watching this because you are interested in seeing how other people function, awesome. We love having you here. By all means, consume everything. But the majority of you who already know yourselves really well, you don't need some of these designations because you already know how to sort yourself and sort your choices effectively. But some of us need this primarily to validate the intuitive choices we're already making. And we need to be able to give some kind of structure and form to say, yes, it's good for trailblazers to act like this. And now I know how to expect, outcomes, and I know what not to put my trust in, and I know what not to expect. And I know what to expect and what excites me about that. And I'm hopeful that having this information will make some of our decision making as authors a lot easier. So that's my hope. Who knows what's going to happen from here? That I feel like, again, I am a trailblazer, and I feel like this is all new territory for us. It's exciting for me, though. I like new territory. And so we're going to see what happens as we all go forth on this adventure together. Hopefully you are here because you also want to be on that adventure with us. And if you do not or are not, that's fine. I don't expect everybody to come along. It's all right. The people that this will be helpful for, it'll be helpful for, and you'll all get what you need out of it, and everybody else will leave it in the dust, and that's where they should leave it. It's fine. It's not going to be for everybody, but for those of you that this will be helpful for, I'm so excited to get into this material, and I'm looking forward to how we're going to use this in the future. Just know we're still going to intersperse some other videos along on the Quitcast, just because I'm number one input in the strengths, Clifton Strengths, and I have to get information out. I have a video I did with Claire about the Enneagram that I want to get out, and then I have other things that I am still going to have interest in. But my primary goal for a while is going to be to deliver some of this archetypes content and get it out of my brain and off of my hard drive and into, everyone else's consciousness, so we can start talking about this stuff. And just know, if you're coaching with any of our certified coaches, they're certified in strengths. Nobody knows anything about archetypes yet. None of our staff, like, they're all learning this along with you. We did do some continuums at the BFA conference that happened over the summer. We are likely going to do some archetype stuff at both our virtual conferences coming up this spring and also our in-person conferences coming up next fall. We're likely going to do some kind of archetype work at both of those places. And then, of course, on this Quitcast and our Patreon. So, all right. Thank you so much for being here. If you listened this far and you happen to know any of your archetypes yet that you have either heard me talk about or seen one of the videos, let me know which ones are the most you, like which ones you're resonating with the most so far. I'm so grateful to hear from people when this is helpful, because it helps me know how to communicate better, again, high communication, and it helps me know where to go in the future. So again, thank you all so much for being here. I will see you next time on the Quitcast. Bye, everybody.